Hi, this is James Cartwright and Matt Burnham. Welcome to our video review of the European institutions trip we took last week. Firstly, we're talking about the European Bank, which we visited in Frankfurt as part of our institutions trip. We were in the group that went to Frankfurt for the bank institution talk.
So what did you think of the talk?
I thought it was interesting when you compare it to the European Union as a cohesive supranational organization, especially when we talk about the interest rate, controlling inflation across the EU, state by state wise. I thought it was very interesting that there is no real way to enforce the suggestions of the European Bank. The only thing you can actually do is go to bank executives and suggest what you think it should be in the best interest of the EU as a whole. But a lot of times those bank executives, especially following the Eurozone crisis, have not followed that to a T, or at least in a delayed manner.
Right, which makes an interesting problem for the central bank, is since they have no real leverage, they have to just roll with what the banks do. And it's interesting just seeing how Germany especially is trying to play a larger role in the financial markets of Europe as a whole, and how they're trying to do that through the central bank. But again, they don't have any leverage to actually do what they want, so they just have to do what they can. But
so you could say it's more of an intergovernmental organization, but at the same time, it is supranational when we think about things like outright monetary spending.
Right. Outright monetary spending is a very controversial topic, especially after the crisis, when they used it as a last resort, just buying up government bonds to try to stabilize the financial markets, create liquidity. But it was a tough time for the ECB, especially, as they were sitting on the sidelines, not much they could do.
And the Germans especially opposed things like outright monetary spending. They did the same thing in post-war reconstruction. It didn't really work out for them. What's your take on what is different for the EU central bank with outright monetary spending versus the German government? So why would you argue that the EU outright monetary spending is a good plan for Europe as a whole, versus why it didn't work for Germany as a single country?
I think the post-war Germany did not have the financial structure to handle the kind of outright monetary spending and inflation that came with it. Whereas with the European Union as a whole, it's a very large network of banks. It's a very robust system that's been tried and tested for many, many years. And so even though you're failing some countries like Greece, as a whole, the financial health is relatively strong.
And the risk is spread out. I mean, that was my point when I was thinking about it. He's talking for Germany. They bought their own debt.
Right.
The EU is spreading out debt across the entire Eurozone, which is a significant change in risk.
So after the ECB, we went to Brussels.
Welcome to Brussels.
Welcome to Brussels. And went to the Commission and the Parliament.
Right. I think the Commission meeting was very interesting. Talked to Miss Laura Berard, who is actually a public representative for the Commission. She's not an expert. She's not someone in the policy, but she's more involved in getting those messages relayed to the public in a way that they can get behind what the Commission's doing and support the initiatives. We talked a lot about migration control and border control. And her first big topic was about hotspots, which there's been a lot of controversy about across the EU, a lot of human rights violation allegations.
It's especially tough for the countries in the southern part of the Eurozone in terms of Italy, Greece. These people taking the brunt of the refugees, they need the help of the European Union in terms of helping handle the applications, handle the administrative side of things, and just easing the process. So
I think my opinion on this is, what's the alternative? So if you're a refugee fleeing from Syria, fleeing from these places, she gave us a stat that in 2017, 9 out of 10 refugees that came into Europe paid organized crime units to help them sneak in. So if you're going to try to reduce those 9 out of 10, the way to do it is through the hotspots. That's the best way you can organize it. And the conditions may not be great, but the problem you have with organized criminals is that you have sex trafficking, human trafficking, and you're not even guaranteed to get across. You could pay the money and never see them again. So I think for refugees in general, it's a better system, but it's obviously still not perfect.
Right, and so jumping ahead a little bit to a meeting we had in Paris where they talked about the development fund. One of the reasons they keep adding more and more money to this fund is to help these countries and to stop the problem at the source and trying to stabilize these countries and help them achieve a safe political climate where these people feel like they can live there, raise a family there, and prosper there instead of having to flee to the European Union, which creates some stress on the system as a whole.
And the president of the commission has been calling it a spirit of solidarity across Europe when it comes to migration. They plan on what year was that? By 2020 they plan on multiplying the European border Coast Guard by almost 10 times. Right now they have 1,600 employees monitoring a very, very large border, and they're planning on putting up to 10,000 border guards by 2020. We had a question at this same meeting: is that militarizing the border? Do you see that as a military or a conservative effort?
Somewhat, it is to an extent just purely in terms of the amount of people moving to the borders to help secure it. But as they explained in the talk, it's not a completely independent system. It's all of the countries are providing people for this force, and they have, at the end of the day, the country who has that border makes the final call on where they go, what they do, things like that, which is an interesting kind of compromise, I think.
Right. It's not like a UN blue helmet deal.
Right.
It's national sovereignty taking over a force that was given to them from a collective fund, which I think is important.
Right. So, after that, we had the cybersecurity talk, which was interesting.
Yeah,
I'd say.
she was a woman who didn't speak very, very good English. But I think the important thing to talk about there is it's all initiatives, right? There's no collective cybersecurity defense team that's just in a room in Brussels and hacking away and making defense. They're advising countries on what to do with this new realm of the military.
Right. And also, she mentioned that her role in this organization was to help the single market in terms of digital access, and was giving a talk on cybersecurity that I'm not sure she was necessarily fully prepared for.
Right. Or that we were prepared for. I thought she got very technical.
Right.
And we aren't computer science students.
Exactly. So, but it was an interesting talk.
So following that day in Brussels, we kind of split up a little bit based on our class schedules. So we have different meetings to talk about. Personally, the next day I went to a Turkey EU relations meeting with a delegate from Turkey, which got very heated due to the nature of Turkish politics right now. But overall, he was very pro-EU, very pro-Turkish accession into the EU, but also skeptical due to what's happening in Turkey with rule of law, democracy, free media. 75% of Turkish foreign direct investment comes from the EU. So I think it is important for that country as a whole economically to get into the EU.
Right.
A couple things he said though were a little skeptical on. He called Turkish accession into the EU the antidote to an aging population in Europe, which I think that's a stretch in arguing to get in. I actually posed to him the question about the media, particularly in terms of Erdogan's election. And I couldn't tell if he really supported his answer to me or whether he was saying that within the scope of being a representative of the state. But his answer to me as to why or how much did the effect of that have on the election, because Erdogan in Turkey has the influence over the one person who runs the media. So that was my question to him, and his answer was, well, it is true that our state-run media is very pro-Erdogan. There's not really many options when it comes to political point of view. His answer to me was, well, we have Twitter, which I was a little skeptical. I love Twitter, huge Twitter guy. I'm on it every day. I get my politics, my sports news, but to see that as my only source of political information or political discourse on both sides,
right,
I think is definitely a stretch. You don't know what's true on there. Anybody can say anything. So I thought it was a weak defense, but.
So in a similar vein, while we were in Brussels, I attended a meeting with the Russian mission for talking to the EU, and it was a very interesting meeting simply because the meeting got very heated towards the end in the Q&A session, and the Q&A session actually ended up going about an hour over time.
Wow.
Which was just because they had very strong views that they wanted to express, and it was very interesting to me that one of the things they kept saying was they just want to talk. Since after the annexation of Crimea, the EU essentially, and the US to an extent, cut off diplomatic ties with Russia for a pretty extended period of time, and they were just saying they kept saying we're tired of being lectured by the West. We want to talk to the West, which I thought was an interesting viewpoint, seeing as what their government's been doing, especially recently.
Yeah.
But it was a really interesting meeting, seeing where they're coming from, how they think, and what they're trying to achieve in terms of relations with the EU.
And the Turkish delegate had similar things to say about the hypocrisy of the West. One of his major complaints about the EU was, if you set these standards that everyone's supposed to follow, and that to get into this club you need to follow, how are countries like Poland and Hungary breaking the rules, blatantly breaking the rules of democracy, and that's accepted. But he said because the Turkish is a Muslim majority, their issues with democracy and rule of law are taken more seriously than Poland and Hungary. So, I mean, in my opinion, I think it's more of a Poland and Hungary, when they were let in, were on the right track towards democracy and have since backtracked, which is more difficult to handle than admission. I think that would be the argument as to why it's not racially or ethnically biased. So the next day, I actually met with a UKIP representative, Mr. Stuart Agnew. He was an MEP in the European Parliament. I was very impressed. I thought he was very intelligent, very well spoken. A lot of his points I didn't agree with. He said that the European Court of Justice serves to take away habeas corpus in domestic UK courts. My question asked how that was possible, and he couldn't really give an explanation. But he was also a large human climate change denier, which got a lot of students flared up. Very, very tense meeting. He was actually a farmer from Norfolk, and was elected in 2009. So what struck me interesting is he has that appeal, right? The same thing that Donald Trump had. He's not a politician. He's not a career people pleaser. This guy was a farmer, got into politics by accident, and ended up being in Brussels as an MEP. His big complaint was that the commission just keeps getting their way, and that it's an erosion of national sovereignty, which I expected him to say. And he had a lot of things to say about agriculture specifically. He argued that English farmers are suffering as the UK is pouring money out of its own budget into the EU, and then the EU in return in this business deal is giving them more sanctions and more environmental and health regulations to follow. So in his opinion, the UK is paying money for increased regulation on their own business.
It's an interesting standpoint in terms of when you take into account the fact that the UK imports, 40% of all the food that they eat?
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see how Brexit affects that, especially the farmers.
But I do think it's a decent argument. This man was a farmer himself. He knows, he was giving us examples of like 10, 15, 20 years ago when he was farming, there weren't all kinds of CO2 gas regulation on how much he can run his tractor, how much chemical he can put on his crop, how much hormone he can give to his animals. And he said his comparison was, now we have to count every gallon of gas that we use and report that back to the EU, and if we go over, it's a large fee. So now farmers who can't use their tractors as much, can't farm as much, and can't make their living that they used to live. So I think that's a valid argument. And I wasn't expecting such points like that. I was expecting a little more wild, off the topic, which he was, but there were quality arguments there.
So that day, I also attended a talk for my transition to market economy class by a woman from Poland, actually, who worked on the environment essentially in the EU Commission, and she was very optimistic, I would say, in terms of her overall outlook on where the EU is heading in terms of greenhouse gases and things like that. One big point that I really agreed with was she kept saying that our generation's consumption patterns will determine the future of energy and therefore the environment, as how we consume energy, how much we need, how much we use. All of that will determine what kind of energy we use. In terms of, if you need lots of energy, then coal is the best option. It's the cheapest, it's the most reliable, but it's destroying our planet at the end of the day, and it's something that we have to take into account. She also talked a lot about how she works with essentially breaking up these supply chains of energies into different companies, because at first it was just one company would produce the energy and then they would distribute the energy. And they had very strong vested interests to produce as much and distribute as much as they possibly could. And they solved that problem pretty efficiently by simply just breaking the transmission system into different companies that would be more competitive in terms of how they deliver it, and also offer things like there's an EU project where you can get a device in your home that monitors all of your energy intake and how much you're consuming, and it'll tell you how much you're paying at that exact moment for the energy and your footprint on the planet, your carbon footprint, and things like that really make a big difference in the long run.
So to wrap things up, in our last few days in Paris, I met with a woman who actually is an IES professor who specializes in Muslim studies, and she talked a little bit about France's Muslim population and the future of Islam in France. Shockingly, 1/8 of French citizens have Muslim origins. That doesn't mean they're practicing Muslims, but they have Islamic heritage.
I found it interesting on that stat that she was saying there's a law in France that says that you cannot ask someone what their religion is.
Right.
If you are asked that on any kind of survey, you can just say simply, you do not have the right to ask me that.
Which is why the number is exactly exact.
Right.
You know what I mean? Another interesting thing was I think what her point was is that there's two roads we can go down in terms of bringing the Islamic community into France as one people, and that's total assimilation, which requires them to give up some of their traditional ideals and westernize a little bit. And then there's that's what Macron wants to see,
Right.
is this new Western Islam. But on the flip side, there's the opportunity for a multicultural community to form, to where the West kind of learns to deal with these cultural differences, and the Muslim community stays intact in its own neighborhood.
Right.
Not neighborhood, but in its own group. And it was a very historical talk. She said that 68% of French casualties in World War II from the French side were Muslims. And I think that she said they've gotten the short end of the stick in that regard. They weren't considered French citizens for a long time, even though a large portion of the deaths for en français were from the Islamic community.
Right, and many of the communities that have popped up, Muslim communities, came from people migrating to France after World War II to help rebuild the country, and they played an incredibly vital role in making France what it is today, and were kind of not treated as full citizens during that time, and it kind of left a stain on France's history going forward with these Muslim populations.
So yeah, I think that was our week on the European Institutions trip. I thought we had great speakers. My favorite trip academically so far that we've had.
For sure.
Thank you, Professor Staub. Great man. Let's go Freiburg. Schwarzbard milk.
Yeah.
Checking off.